Welcome to InfoSec Bytes, your go-to podcast for bite-sized insights on information security, AI, cloud, quantum, and cybersecurity incident root cause analysis. With over 100 episodes, we've got you covered in the latest trends and tips. Please like, subscribe, and share to join the conversation on various platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon Music, and stay secure. Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are undertaking a critical deep dive into the Jaguar Land Rover, or JLR, security incident that struck in September 2025. Now, this wasn't just, another corporate data breach. This event, it immediately captured the attention of national governments, economic bodies. It was actually categorized as the single most economically damaging cyber event in UK history. We're talking about a systemic failure, really, that went far beyond the walls of just one manufacturer.
Yeah, the scale is absolutely what defines this incident. And that's our mission today, isn't it? To understand not just the mechanics of the attack itself, but its colossal economic footprint. Because when we discuss cyber incidents, we often focus, maybe too much, on the direct cost to the victim company.
Right, what it cost them.
Exactly. But the JLR failure, it cost the UK economy an estimated $1.9 billion. I mean, that figure just dwarfs almost every other security event in recent memory. So we have to explore why an intrusion on a single, albeit massive, manufacturer caused such a rapid systemic economic failure. How did it cascade through and affect, what was it, over 5,000 interdependent organizations?
5,000?
Yeah. This is, arguably the new face of cyber risk. It's not just about data anymore.
Okay, let's start with the timeline then and the calculated nature of this disruption. Because the attackers, they were clearly strategic in their timing. The initial intrusion was launched late on Sunday, August 31st, 2025. Tell us about that timing. Why Sunday night? What's the thinking there?
Well, it was textbook, really. A calculated witching hour maneuver, as they say. Attackers know operational security is, it's thinnest late on a Sunday night, isn't it? Weekend staffing levels are dramatically reduced. Security teams, they're often running on skeleton crews, maybe just monitoring alerts.
And the key decision makers aren't necessarily on call or easy to reach immediately.
Precisely. So this timing, it maximized what we call dwell time. That's the period the attackers had inside the system before JLR could really muster a full-scale, coordinated defensive response. By exploiting that sort of quiet window, they ensured they had deep access before the working week even properly began.
And the response then, once the breach was finally confirmed, it had to be total, didn't it? There was no half measure.
It absolutely had to be. By Monday morning, September 1st, JLR, they realized the depth of the penetration. They were forced into a total global shutdown. And this wasn't just a partial outage, like taking a few servers offline. This was a complete proactive halt. All global IT systems and, crucially, all production lines.
All of them, across the board.
Yeah, we're talking assembly plants across the UK, Solihull, Halewood, Wolverhampton, and also their highly automated international facilities, Slovakia, Brazil, India.
So the only way to stop the bleeding, effectively, was just to pull the plug on everything.
That was it. The only safe option, it seems.
And the financial timing of this halt, that was just devastating, wasn't it? It compounded the loss enormously.
Oh, brutally effective from the attacker's perspective. The production halt wasn't short either. It lasted for approximately 5 weeks.
5 weeks?
Yeah, roughly 40 days of continuous manufacturing disruption. And critically, this happened right as the UK motor industry hit the high-volume new plate day sales period.
Ah, okay, so that's peak time for them.
Exactly. It's a time when manufacturing output is normally highest, dealer commitments are tightest. Missing that crucial period, well, it maximizes lost profit, obviously, but it also damages future order books. It turns a negative financial event into a deep, painful hole.
Let's try and put some numbers on that immense scale for our listener. Because £1.9 billion, it's almost abstract until you break it down. Where did that money actually go or get lost?
That's a great point. So the total cost to the UK economy was modeled by the Cyber Monitoring Center, the CMC, at $1.9 billion. The expected range they gave was between $1.6 billion and $2.1 billion.
So huge range, but centered around that 1.9 mark.
Right. And the direct loss to JLR itself was staggering. They were losing an estimated $108 million per week.
Wow, $108 million a week.
Yeah. And listen, this wasn't just lost profit from vehicles they couldn't sell. That figure includes the fixed costs, maintaining operational infrastructure, salaries, rent, utilities for factories that were sitting completely idle, generating absolutely nothing. They saw a weekly reduction of nearly 5,000 vehicles from UK operations alone. That's massive revenue flow just stopped instantly.
Okay, now who was behind this? The name itself is quite alarming. Scattered lapsus hunters. That doesn't sound like your average script kiddie group. It sounds, well, professional. Bit of a Frankenstein's monster, actually.
See, that name is incredibly revealing, I think. Scattered lapsus hunters, it strongly suggests a hybrid operation.
Yeah.
A sophisticated collaboration between at least 3 major English-speaking cybercrime entities we know quite well.
Which ones?
Scattered Spider, Lapsus, and Shiny Hunters. Scattered Spider is infamous for its proficiency in vishing and social engineering, getting people on the phone, tricking them. Lapsus is known more for credential theft and causing internal network chaos once they're in. And Shiny Hunters, well, they specialize in large-scale data exfiltration and extortion, selling data, basically.
Putting them together gives them quite the toolkit.
The perfect toolkit for this kind of breach, arguably. Highly effective social engineering to get that initial foothold. Rapid internal movement, thanks to the Lapsus style. And then maximum destructive capability, possibly leveraging Shiny Hunter's experience in causing damage or exfiltrating data for leverage.
So their motive wasn't exactly subtle then.
Not at all. It seems pretty clear it was threefold. 1, immediate financial gain, maybe through ransom, maybe extortion later. 2, inflicting maximal reputational damage on a huge global brand. And 3, crucially, demonstrating capability, showing they could paralyze a major industrial target like JLR.
Right. That sends a message.
A very clear and frightening message. When you successfully bring down a company responsible for, 20% of UK car production, you're telling every other large enterprise globally, we can do this to you too.
And adding to this whole narrative of failure,
Yeah.
this September breach wasn't even JLR's first major warning shot in 2025, was it? They'd been hit earlier in the year.
That's right. Which suggests the critical security flaws were known, or at least should have been known, and worryingly, not fully fixed.
What happened earlier?
The March 2025 incident, that was perpetrated by a group called Hellcat. And guess what? Hellcat also gained initial access by exploiting stolen credentials, specifically Jira logins in that case.
Jira again. Oh.
And they proceeded to leak internal JLR data. So that earlier breach, it was a massive flashing red light. It exposed deep, persistent security gaps around identity and third-party access. The September attack, effectively, it utilized the exact same playbook. Identity compromise followed by lateral movement. It strongly suggests that the critical security deficiencies exposed by Hellcat just weren't fully remediated.
So they got a very specific, very costly warning. And 4 months later, the same vulnerability gets exploited again, but this time with utterly catastrophic results.
Exactly. It's a tough lesson.
Right. Now, this is where the narrative shifts, I think, from high-level economics down to the, frankly, terrifying simplicity of the root cause. This is the moment that should probably alarm every single security leader listening right now. The entry point wasn't some complex million-dollar zero-day exploit bought on the dark web. It was, almost shockingly, basic credential abuse, facilitated by social engineering or vishing.
The irony is profound, isn't it? JLR, a company building these incredibly complex, multi-million-pound, highly engineered luxury vehicles, taken down by what essentially boils down to a forgotten password.
A forgotten password. How?
The core mechanism, the way they got in, was the successful use of functional login credentials. Credentials that had been harvested by InfoStealer malware way back in 2021.
2021, so 4 years old.
4 years old. Think about the concept of credential debt here. A 4-year-old login, probably scraped off some employee's machine during the pandemic remote work rush, maybe from a personal device, that provided the ultimate master key to a 2025 high-security environment.
That failure points directly to 2 enormous and maybe non-technical issues, doesn't it? Time and policy.
Precisely. It signals a catastrophic failure in what we call credential lifecycle management. Why were these accounts still active after 4 years? Why weren't they subject to automated rotation or expiration policies? Or just immediate invalidation after, say, 90 days of dormancy? When these InfoStealers run, they dump credentials into vast logs. These logs get sold, often quite cheaply, on underground forums. If your company maintains accounts that are still functional after 4 years, well, you're basically guaranteeing that any attacker who buys one of those old logs gets immediate valid entry.
It makes the CSO's job almost impossible if that foundational stuff isn't right.
Completely impossible.
And even if the credentials were old, the expectation in modern security surely is that there should have been another guardrail. Multi-factor authentication, MFA, was that missing entirely? Or just bypassed?
It seems it was either missing or, maybe worse, just inconsistently enforced on the most high-value access points. We know reports suggest that key systems, including that Jira project management system again, which is a common entry vector for third parties and the corporate VPNs, they lacked robust MFA enforcement.
So not everywhere it needed to be.
Exactly. In some cases, maybe the MFA that was present was the weaker kind, perhaps vulnerable to phishing or prompt bombing. But the core issue seems to have been that this basic foundational control just wasn't mandatory everywhere it absolutely should have been.
The attackers were using a very common IMIRAE AT-TNCK technique here, T278, which is just valid accounts. Can you maybe elaborate for us why using a valid account is often so much more dangerous than, say, trying to brute force a password?
Sure. When an attacker uses brute force, or maybe a complex exploit, they generate a lot of noise. They're immediately flagged by almost every decent perimeter defense system, firewalls, intrusion detection system.
Okay, they stand out.
Right. But when they use T10078, a valid, authenticated account, they basically just walk right past the front door, looking like a legitimate user. They look exactly like an employee logging in from home or a contractor accessing a system they're supposed to access. They bypass behavioral analysis, at least initially. And this is exactly why we keep talking about zero trust as the antidote, because it seems JLR was operating at least partly on an implicit trust model. The system trusted the validity of the login itself. It didn't constantly verify what that login was attempting to do next.
Never trust, always verify.
That's the mantra.
And what they did next, of course, was lateral movement, moving sideways across the network. And that was enabled by the second core security failure mentioned, the widespread violation of the principle of least privilege.
That's where the damage multiplier really kicks in. The principle of least privilege, it basically dictates that any single user or any single account should only have the absolute minimal access necessary to perform its legitimate function. Nothing more. The fact that the attackers, once they were inside using what might have been a relatively low-level stolen credential, could then move apparently unhindered and rapidly escalate their privileges across the network. Well, it proves this principle was likely disregarded quite widely.
Can you give us an analogy, maybe, to make that failure really stick for people?
Okay, imagine you hire an external delivery driver just to drop off some supplies at the factory gates. Under proper least privilege, that driver gets a one-time pass, maybe just to the loading bay. And that is it. They can't go anywhere else.
Makes sense.
In JLR's case, it seems that delivery driver's stolen ID didn't just open the loading bay. It also somehow opened the door to the engineering vault, maybe the CEO's office corridor, and critically, the master control panel for the entire assembly line. Because the initial compromised account seems to have had overly broad permissions, maybe accessing R&D data, finance systems, and production controls, the attackers had free rein. They could effectively go anywhere and install their destructive malware everywhere that account could reach.
And this entire discussion, it feels inseparable from the third-party risk environment, doesn't it? JLR had outsourced a huge part of its IT and cyber responsibility. That just introduces a massive attack surface.
The vendor ecosystem vulnerability is absolutely crucial here. JLR held a substantial $800 million tie-in contract with Tata Consultancy Services, TCS, to manage a significant portion of its computer systems, including aspects of cybersecurity. And it appears that both the March incident and the September incident exploited credentials associated with this third-party access, those Jira logins, the VPN logins.
So it came through the supplier, potentially?
Potentially, yes, or at least credentials used by the supplier. Which means that JLR's security posture, regardless of the millions they might have invested internally, was ultimately only as strong as the security hygiene maintained by the weakest link in their vendor chain. If an external consultant's laptop gets compromised by an info stealer back in 2021, and they're still using their valid JLR access credentials from that machine to connect, well, that vulnerability transfers instantly onto JLR's internal network.
Right. So once the attackers were inside, they weren't just looking to steal data initially, were they? They were aiming for maximum physical impact. What was the technical execution of the actual shutdown? How did they stop the factories?
The core goal seems to have been operational paralysis. They deployed ransomware, or perhaps more likely, given the scale of the destruction, highly destructive malware, maybe wipers aimed specifically at crippling servers and halting factory operations. They targeted systems that directly interfaced with the operational technology, the OT, the production control systems, the PLCs, the robotics controllers.
And the data theft aspect. They initially said no data was stolen.
They did initially claim no data theft, yes. But JLR was forced to revise that assessment on September 10th. They confirmed that some data had been affected, including customer information. Now, that confirmation was, in a way, secondary to the 5 weeks of operational paralysis in terms of immediate impact, but the confirmed data breach immediately brought in the regulatory scrutiny of the UK GDPR, which is a whole other headache.
Okay, so now we need to bridge that gap. How does a simple forgotten password, maybe combined with a weak MFA, escalate to nearly £2 billion in national economic damage? This feels like the point where the IT failure becomes a structural, architectural catastrophe, the ITOT trap you mentioned.
This is absolutely the crux of the deep dive, I think. The JLR manufacturing environment, like many modern factories, was the embodiment of the smart factory concept. They had tightly integrated their information technology, the corporate stuff, servers, email, databases with their operational technology, the industrial control systems, the robots, the assembly line processes.
Which they did for efficiency, presumably.
Exactly. In pursuit of maximal efficiency, real-time adjustments, minimizing waste. And while this integration is fantastic for productivity when everything's working, it creates a monolithic single point of failure when security is breached.
So efficiency was maximized, but resilience was completely sacrificed in the process.
That seems to be the case here, yeah. The critical architectural failure appears to have been insufficient network segmentation between the corporate IT network, where the initial login breach likely occurred, and the OT infrastructure that actually runs the physical assembly lines. Think of this lack of segmentation as like having no fire doors between your office floor and your critical manufacturing floor. Once the fire starts in the office, the IT breach, it spreads instantly and uncontrollably to the factory, the OT systems.
And that lack of isolation, that lack of fire doors, it left the CISO with only one viable and frankly terrifying option for containment.
The CSO really had no choice but to activate that global emergency brake. Because the systems were so intertwined, so integrated, they couldn't simply isolate the breached corporate network without risking unpredictable and potentially dangerous interference with the live production lines. Imagine robots going haywire.
Yeah, okay. Unthinkable.
So the only truly safe containment option was the total, immediate shutdown of all global operations. The very necessity of this drastic measure, the one that cost the UK billions, it retroactively confirmed the fundamental architectural vulnerability.
If proper segmentation had been in place, using established models, the breach should have been contained just to the corporate side, right? The factories could have kept running.
Absolutely. In theory. Security architects universally advocate for models like the Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture. The Purdue model, it dictates distinct, strictly segmented layers. Layer 4 and 5 are the business systems, Layer 1 and 2 are the control systems, and there are strong boundaries between them. If JLR had rigorously implemented something like this model, those compromised JIRA credentials or whatever got them into the IT side should never have been able to reach, say, the PLC controllers on the factory floor. The fact that the breach did cascade into total production paralysis really validates that the critical separation, that essential boundary, was functionally absent or easily bypassed.
And the resulting economic devastation, as we said, didn't stop at JLR's balance sheet. It became a systemic event for the entire UK economy.
Yeah, the ripple effect was where the majority of that 1.9 billion loss actually materialized. That CMC analysis identified that the incident directly affected over 5,000 UK organizations. And these weren't just peripheral businesses. They included nearly 1,000 Tier 1 suppliers companies supplying major components like chassis, engine parts, sophisticated electronics, and then thousands more in the Tier 2 and Tier 3 supply chain, the ones who supply raw materials, sub-assemblies to the Tier 1s.
This immediately exposes the extreme fragility of the modern just-in-time manufacturing model, doesn't it? Which relies so heavily on perfect predictability and smooth operation.
Completely. The just-in-time model is, financially brilliant when production runs smoothly. It eliminates costly warehousing, maximizes capital efficiency, but it means that suppliers only produce exactly what JLR needs right when they need it. And crucially, they only get paid when JLR accepts and pays for that component.
So when JLR shuts down for 5 weeks,
those 5,000 organizations are instantly cut off from their primary, sometimes only, revenue stream. Their inventory piles up, unsold, their invoices go unpaid. Cash flow just stops dead.
okay. And we absolutely must talk about the human cost here, because this is where the incident moves beyond corporate finance and becomes truly tragic for many people.
The human element is immense and often gets overlooked in these technical discussions. The disruption impacted the job security for an estimated 200,000 UK workers.
200,000.
Yes. That includes JLR's own 33,000 direct employees, But the vast majority, over 104,000 jobs, are within that fragile supplier network. Now, for large corporations, a 5-week pause is a massive financial hit, no doubt. But for small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs, especially those concentrated in the West Midlands and the Northwest, where JLR has major hubs, this was potentially an existential crisis.
Tell us more about that SME crisis specifically. What did 5 weeks without any revenue actually mean for some of those smaller firms?
It meant a crippling, instantaneous cash flow crunch. Many of these smaller, highly specialized firms, they operate on extremely tight margins. They often rely on, say, 30-day payment terms just to meet their monthly payroll. Reports during the incident indicated some smaller suppliers, often highly reliant on JLR for maybe 70, 80, 90% of their revenue, had at best a week of cash flow left.
Just 1 week?
Just 1 week, they suddenly couldn't pay their staff, their rent, their utilities, their own suppliers down the chain. We saw some really distressing reports of small business owners being asked by commercial lenders to put up personal assets, including their own homes, as personal guarantees for emergency loans, just to cover basic operational costs until JLR could restart and pay them.
That's unbelievable. Putting their homes on the line because of the cyber attack elsewhere.
It really underscores that cyber resilience is no longer just a corporate IT concern. It's fundamentally a matter of national economic security and even social security when you see impacts like that.
Okay, let's shift to the response and compliance side. When a confirmed data breach includes customer information, the regulatory clock starts ticking immediately. The scrutiny from the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, under UK GDPR, is basically mandatory, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the compliance timeline here is a major area of concern, or at least intense interest, for the regulators. JLR detected the attack and implemented that global shutdown on September 1st. However, they didn't formally notify the ICO until September 10th. That was after they publicly confirmed that some data had indeed been affected.
So an 8-day gap.
An 8-day gap, and this raises serious questions regarding compliance with Article 33 of the UK GDPR.
What does GDPR actually require in terms of notification timing?
It mandates that organizations notify the supervisory authority, which is the ICO in the UK, without undue delay, and where feasible, not later than 72 hours after becoming aware of a personal data breach. That is, a breach likely to result in a risk to individuals' rights and freedoms.
72 hours. 3 days, not 8.
Precisely. The fact that they waited 8 days, presumably while they were focused, understandably perhaps, on operational restoration and containment, suggests a possible breach of this core compliance obligation. This delay will certainly be a key factor in the ICO's ongoing investigation.
And that investigation, it will focus intensely on those core security failures we already outlined, won't it? The old password, the lack of consistent MFA.
Oh, absolutely. The ICO will scrutinize the adequacy of JLR's security measures under GDPR Article 32 Security of Processing. Specifically, the failure to consistently enforce multi-factor authentication, especially on critical points like VPNs and third-party access portals, is a textbook deficiency under Article 32. And their apparent failure to remediate that legacy credential exposure from 2021. Well, that confirms a long-standing known vulnerability wasn't adequately addressed. For a company of this scale with a $28 billion global turnover, the potential GDPR fine is frankly staggering.
What is the maximum penalty the ICO could realistically impose here? What are we talking about?
Well, GDPR allows for fines up to the higher of $20 million or 4% of a company's total worldwide annual turnover of the preceding financial year. With JLR's turnover cited at $28 billion, that 4% figure, we are talking about a potential theoretical maximum fine of over $1.1 billion.
Over £1 billion just for the GDPR fine.
Theoretically, yes. Now, that is the absolute ceiling, and large fines are often contested and sometimes reduced based on cooperation and remediation efforts. But the threat is very, very real, and the regulatory pressure will be immense. It just reinforces the idea that getting the basics of identity management right isn't merely good practice, it's a catastrophic financial necessity.
The economic catastrophe reached such a level of systemic risk, impacting those 5,000 suppliers, that it actually transcended the corporate sphere and required direct intervention from the UK government. That feels unprecedented for a single corporate cyber incident.
It truly is unprecedented in this context, yes. Recognizing that the critical UK manufacturing sector, that vital supplier base, was facing potential mass liquidation due to the JLR shutdown, the government had to step in. They announced a substantial $1.5 billion loan guarantee scheme. Now, this guarantee didn't mean the government was just handing out cash directly to suppliers.
How did it work then?
Rather, they were underwriting the risk for commercial banks, essentially telling the banks, lend these struggling suppliers the money they need to survive, and if they default because of this crisis, the government will cover a large portion of the loss. This allowed the banks to release essential, immediate working capital to stabilize that cash-strapped supply chain. Without that intervention, it's highly likely hundreds, potentially even thousands, of those SMEs would simply have gone bankrupt within weeks.
But this kind of intervention, necessary as it might seem in the moment, it raises a really important longer-term policy question, doesn't it? Does government support in a crisis like this create what economists call moral hazard?
That is the essential debate we absolutely need to have now. The term moral hazard, it refers to the risk that one party will behave differently, maybe take on greater risk, precisely because it knows it's protected from the negative consequences if things go wrong. So the question is, if large, systemically important companies like JLR anticipate a sort of de facto state bailout, or at least guaranteed support for their critical supplier ecosystem following a catastrophic cyber event, will they become complacent?
Complacent how?
Well, they might underinvest in adequate cyber insurance, perhaps deeming the premiums too high. Or they might prioritize short-term efficiency gains over more costly but more robust resilience measures like rigorous network segmentation. Basically, they might subconsciously rely on the state functioning as the insurer of last resort when a major failure inevitably occurs.
So the short-term necessity of saving potentially thousands of jobs creates a long-term risk of increased complacency across the entire sector.
Exactly. It's a difficult balancing act for the government. They probably need to clarify how they'll address this going forward, perhaps by imposing mandatory minimum resilience standards on companies deemed systemically important to the UK economy, making future state support conditional on having robust, independently audited cyber defenses in place before an incident happens.
Makes sense. Finally, let's look quickly at the recovery roadmap. How long does it actually take to restart a highly integrated, globally distributed manufacturing system like JLR's after a 5-week total shutdown like this?
It's an incredibly complex forensics and engineering task. The recovery involves, first, confirming complete forensic containment, making sure the attackers are truly out and haven't left any back doors. Then, meticulous system restoration from clean backups, which is often harder than it sounds, especially for OT systems. And then it's a phased, very carefully monitored restart, which began, we understand, in early October. However, the timeline for getting back to full recovery, hitting those pre-incident production levels, that's vast. JLR themselves apparently don't expect to hit full manufacturing capacity until early January 2026.
January 2026, so that's 5 months.
A 5-month window. From the initial breach in early September to full operational capability hopefully returning in January. It just underscores the profound complexity and the very long tail of restoring deeply integrated IT and OT systems after a truly destructive cyber attack. It's not a quick fix.
Okay, so if you are listening to this and you operate in manufacturing, critical national infrastructure, or really any sector that relies on a complex supply chain, the JLR incident provides possibly the most expensive business lesson in UK history. What are the absolute non-negotiable strategic mandates that this 1.9 billion failure has exposed?
Well, the mandate, I think, starts and absolutely ends with identity and access management reform. The JLR failure confirms, yet again, that identity is the new perimeter. And when that identity perimeter fails, everything else can fail behind it. Organizations simply must adopt a zero trust architecture, or ZPA. This means that core principle, never trust, always verify, has to apply rigorously, not just to people logging in, but to every application trying to talk to another application, every device connecting, every data flow across both the IT and, crucially, the OT estate.
There's some breach.
And the most immediate practical fix within that is MFA. But it has to be the right kind of MFA, doesn't it? Absolutely essential. We need mandatory and critically phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication enforced everywhere sensitive. Standard SMS codes or simple push notifications, they can still be bypassed through sophisticated social engineering, SIM swapping, or prompt bombing fatigue. We are talking about strong phishing-resistant methods, things like FIDO2 hardware keys, certificate-based authentication on managed devices, enforced on all sensitive access points, VPNs, ERP systems, cloud administration consoles, and especially those remote access portals used by third-party vendors like TCS. That has to become a non-negotiable line item in every security budget.
And addressing that infamous 4-year-old credential, how do you realistically neutralize that kind of legacy credential debt that might be lurking in your systems?
This requires rigorous automated credential lifecycle management. You have to implement automated short-cycle rotation policies for privileged accounts. You need strict expiration policies for all accounts. If an account is inactive for, say, 90 days, it must be automatically locked or disabled, not just left dormant. Furthermore, if your security tools detect an infostealer malware infection on any company device or even a personal device used for work access, every single stored credential on that device must be presumed compromised. They need to be forcibly expired or rotated immediately by the security team. The goal is to make sure that legacy credentials from 2021 are functionally inert, useless by 2025.
Okay, moving to the architecture side. That IT/OT convergence failure was clearly the catastrophe multiplier here. How do organizations structurally mitigate that specific risk now, learning from JLR?
Structural architectural separation is basically a non-negotiable insurance policy against this kind of cascade failure. Organizations, especially in manufacturing and critical infrastructure, must implement strict segmentation. Guided by established models like the Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture we mentioned, this means robust, maybe even air-gapped in places, network separation between the corporate IT systems where attackers typically gain their initial access using phishing, stolen credentials, etc., and the operational technology systems that run the actual factory floor or plant processes. IT access should really terminate at a highly controlled demilitarized zone, or DMZ. It should be fundamentally unable to directly interact with sensitive industrial control systems without passing through multiple stringent security checks. This is genuinely the only reliable way to limit the blast radius if, or rather when, the IT side gets breached.
So the idea is, if the IT network is compromised, the OT network has to be designed to keep running safely, perhaps in a limited mode, but not just collapse.
That's exactly the concept. It's often called designing for safe degraded operations. The architecture must allow critical OT assets, the essential safety systems, the core production units, to transition to a safe, predefined, controlled operational mode. Instead of requiring the kind of total global shutdown that JLR was forced into, this involves things like having redundant, perhaps even offline, control systems that can maintain essential, safe functions even when the main IT connectivity is completely severed or deemed untrustworthy. The inability to isolate functions meant paralysis for JLR. The goal now must be controlled, predictable resilience.
When facing potential disruption of this magnitude, what's the ultimate metric we should be focusing on? How do we measure true resilience in this context?
Resilience, particularly when operational uptime is tied directly to potentially billions in revenue and economic stability, is ultimately measured by mean time to repair, or MTTR. How fast can you get back up and running safely? Organizations have to move beyond just tracking mean time to detect, MTTD. Yes, detecting quickly is important, but it doesn't really matter how fast you detect a breach if it still takes you 5 months to fully restore production afterwards. Companies need to conduct regular, rigorous, and realistic incident response exercises. And these exercises must simulate a full production halt scenario, specifically involving an IT/OT boundary failure. Restoration processes, data backups for critical control systems, failover plans, they all must be meticulously documented and rehearsed regularly. The aim should be to shrink that potential 5-month recovery window down into weeks or maybe even days by mastering the recovery process before the real incident hits.
And finally, let's come back to those 5,000 affected suppliers. What proactive steps must they be taking now to survive the next systemic shockwave originating from one of their major customers?
Yeah, the suppliers, particularly those in Tier 0.5, Tier 1, and Tier 2, the ones most closely integrated, they absolutely must take explicit financial and security steps to protect themselves. Financially, they need to perform realistic assessments of their revenue concentration. How much of their business relies on a single large customer like JLR, and based on that risk, maintain sufficient liquidity buffers, enough cash reserves to manage extended shutdowns or payment delays from that customer. Operationally, on the security front, their own compliance needs to align rigorously with the regulations and standards specific to their industry. For automotive manufacturing, that increasingly means standards like ISO say 21434.
What did that cover?
It mandates specific cybersecurity controls throughout the entire vehicle lifecycle, including, crucially, the production phase. It ensures that vulnerabilities aren't inadvertently introduced lower down the supply chain, perhaps in a component they supply, which might then be exploited later to re-enter the major manufacturer system through that trusted component. The whole chain has to become resilient, you see, not just the company at the top tier. What's truly fascinating when you step back and look at this whole JLR breach, it wasn't really an existential threat stemming from some futuristic nightmare scenario like nation-state cyber warfare or quantum decryption cracking everything. It was caused at its root by the unglamorous, almost mundane failure to enforce basic security hygiene. A forgotten 4-year-old password, likely combined with inconsistent MFA enforcement. The staggering $1.9 billion cost wasn't generated by the sophistication of the hack itself, but entirely by the inherent fragility of their integrated architectural design and the corresponding brittleness of the just-in-time supply chain that relied utterly upon it.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought. The JLR incident proves, I think, definitively that for critical infrastructure and manufacturing sectors especially, cyber risk is no longer just some localized IT problem that the security team handles in a back room. It is an existential business risk, one that threatens operational continuity, financial stability, and even national economic security. So the key takeaway for you, our listener, has to be this. If a company with JLR's vast resources, brand reputation, and engineering prowess can be brought to its knees for 5 weeks by a single unexpired password, could your organization, and just as importantly, your supply chain, survive a similar 5-week revenue halt? Or are you confident you're protected better, architecturally and operationally, than JLR evidently was? Something to really think about. Thanks for tuning into InfoSec Bytes. Keep exploring our 100-plus deep dives on information security, AI, cloud, quantum, and cybersecurity incident root cause analysis. Please like, subscribe. We are on various platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon Music, and share to stay connected and keep your cyber defenses strong.